I'd like to welcome you to this channel, to the Good Funeral Guide channel, and thank you for joining this conversation, this series of conversations that we're having around the environmental impact of a funeral, a really important conversation that's just starting to be debated by funeral professionals and the public likewise. So for this very first conversation in this series, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Baroness Natalie Bennett. Natalie was leader of the Green Party of England and Wales from 2012 to 2016. She led the party to a great result in the 2015 elections, and she continues to work full-time in politics, particularly involved with the anti-fracking movement. And she was appointed to the House of Lords in 2019, and she's also a member of the board of the European Green Foundation. So it would be interesting, Natalie, as well during this conversation to chat with you potentially about what other countries in Europe are doing in this area, and if there are any tips and thoughts of ways of going greener in the funeral world that are inspired by other countries. So Natalie, I would like to start off by asking you to share a little about your journey into environmentalism. Tell us a little bit about yourself and that journey for you.
Well, sure. So people don't have to sit there wondering. The accent comes from Australia originally, and my first degree was agricultural science, which makes me really unusual in politics. And there's not many people from a scientific background in politics, which is a grave pity, I think, in many regards. My first degree was agricultural science. I'm very interested in soils. I'm very interested in nature. But what that degree taught me was essentially Australian farming wasn't so much farming its soils as mining them. And so that partly led me to follow one of my other political foundations, which is feminism. I became a feminist at age 5 when I was told, because you're a girl, you're not allowed to have a bicycle. And so I became a journalist. I went and worked for the National Commission on Women's Affairs in Thailand as a volunteer, came to the UK as a journalist. And it was actually on the 1st of January 2006 resolution to do something about the state of the world that I joined the Green Party. Just as decisions are made in Westminster, in local councils, yes, you can campaign, and I very much support campaigning and people doing politics in all sorts of different ways. But actually, I wanted to be where the decisions were. But I never would have predicted that it would lead me to being in the House of Lords as I am now. And if you hear any sort of dinging noise in the background, that's because the Commons is doing various things behind me, and I can't switch it off in this room.
That's great. Good to have the real life sound effects. Very interesting about your comments about soil. Actually, tonight I'm going to go and see George Monbiot talking, and he wrote an absolutely fascinating article in The Guardian recently about soil. Did you read it?
Yes, and I mean, soils is one of my passions. I was in agricultural science 30 years ago, essentially taught soils as a chemistry subject, which, we now know, I think we knew then, but it was kind of being buried, literally, that in a healthy teaspoon of soil, there should be 1 billion organisms. And I wrote a report for Molly Scott-Cato, our former MEP for the Southwest, a few years ago, really updating my soil science knowledge. And what we understand now is the incredible complexity and importance of all those soil organisms. Many of our antibiotics come from microbes in the soil, and they actually work with plants to fight off diseases. And that's just one small example of the way in which the interactions are so crucial. And fertilizers and pesticides just kill those systems dead. And that's one of the reasons why we have to go towards a regenerative sort of agriculture, as George Monbiot is advocating, agroecology. These are the directions we have to take, and the directions that give us the food security, which is one of the issues we're very much focused on at the moment.
Yeah, that's very interesting. On a very broad level, what do you think is the key challenge that we face getting people to think more environmentally, to think about going greener?
I think what we have to do is paint people the pictures, show them the ways in which we're creating a better society. Hope is the really crucial emotion. What we have is politics. People often lament, centrist politics doesn't seem to be doing well. But that's utterly unsurprising, because where we are now is unstable and very bad. economically, environmentally, socially, politically, educationally. Think of all those students laden with those massive amounts of debt. And all these schools been turned into exam factories. So where we are now is really unstable. You have the far right trading in fear, saying, oh, it's a difficult, dangerous world, and we've got to shove those others away, whoever those others are, to keep them out. Broadly, my side of politics is saying we know there's enough resources on this planet for everyone to have a decent life if we just share them out fairly. And by doing that, there's a great book called The Spirit Level that shows how more equal society, everybody, even the richest, are actually better off.
Okay, good tip on the book. Thank you. Have you thought, Natalie, much about the environmental impact of a funeral?
Yes, I have. I mean, I've thought quite a bit about the whole nature of funerals, the nature of mourning. And it was a tragedy that forced me to do that. When I was 23, I was in a car accident in which my mother was killed. And what we had in Australia was a very, very traditional mainstream sort of funeral followed by a cremation. And I was only 23. That's obviously, most people at that age haven't thought very much about death and funerals. But what I thought through that experience was that both our society really has lost mourning rituals, ways of managing. I can remember actually sitting in that funeral thinking, I really wish we had rituals and things that I could just follow of how to get through this experience, be supported through this experience, which our society just really didn't have. And the nature of the funeral, it was just swept along by sort of, it was in a church, a minister conducted it. Whether any of those things were really what Mum would have wanted, I had some concerns at the time and still do, but there wasn't really any other model then in Australia, and this was 1989, available. And so, I think I think a good death, a good farewell are really important, crowning points of a good life, ideally. And these are things we need to think about a lot more. People, I have heard of, wouldn't really say I've been to, but I've heard of people, having funerals where people in a situation where they know they've got an illness that's going to kill them, planning their own funeral, planning the music, being able to do this in a way that it's part of a good death. And I think that's how it should be, both for the person facing death, but also for the people left behind, the people mourning.
Yeah, that's really, really lovely to hear. And it's kind of the perennial question is, who is a funeral actually for? Is it for the person who's died, or is it for the people who are left behind? And I guess certainly from a non-religious perspective, it's very much for the people who are left behind. And interesting what you were saying about a good death and the kind of the entrapments of a ceremony. And it's I guess it seems to us increasingly that it's those things that are causing the problems. So, for instance, there were 3 million single-use plastic coffin handles used last year, and an oasis on flower displays, and the whole concept of embalmment rather than more natural care of the body after death. Have you thought about what kind of funeral you would like to have?
Yes, and I actually have got written in my will. Actually, I think it was a codicil to my will, so I sort of thought about it afterwards. But written in my will that I'd like, and I haven't sort of worked out details of this, but saying I would like a natural funeral, in an environment where you get a tree planted on top of you and those sorts of things. I haven't worked through the details or worked out a where, but I do actually have expressed in my will a desire for that type of funeral. I'm not religious. That's just the way I am, have been for many years. And I care about nature, and I care about the environmental impact of what happens to my body after death. So that seems to me the natural and obvious step to take, and to have that written down. So it is there in writing.
Very, very sensible. Do you mind me asking you if your preference is for cremation or burial?
What I was thinking there was it was a burial, underneath a tree. To be honest, I haven't actually gone into the fine details of this and working out. My understanding is that would probably be more environmentally friendly. But I guess one never knows. But if one gets a bit older, as I get a bit older, if I'm lucky enough to get a bit older, then something you probably think about more and look into more and do the full details. I just wanted to set out that sort of basic natural framework.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's interesting, or it's interesting to us. Maybe that's kind of odd, but it's interesting to us, and generally isn't interesting to most people. But burial, obviously, without embalming, is the most environmentally friendly way to go. But then, of course, it's around choice of coffin, and then miles traveled to and from the place of burial. So there are so many different things. Once you start to unpick our concept of what a funeral tradition is, it's so interesting to see all the different elements that make up a potentially, pretty catastrophic carbon footprint. So, but there are so many wonderful, ways which actually are so much away from the consumer element of a funeral, that really are about, as you were talking about, a good death, about being hands-on, about being thoughtful, about rituals, about sharing and communication, that aren't about the trappings that we really want to start looking at. As I said, you're a member of the European group. Are you aware of things that are done abroad that maybe we should be thinking about?
What I would say is what I know about from continental Europe generally is, I think you have societies where traditions have continued on in with much less interruption than they have in the UK. And I mean, that's a product of perhaps stronger religious communities. It's a product of communities that have moved less than people very often have in the UK, communities that industrialise much later. And so I think that's probably both for good and for ill. I mean, I happen to know a French village moderately well, and there, funerals, but more or less the whole village goes to the funeral, and there's a real community element and community support that comes around individuals in that village. And that pops as the positive side of it, which is not necessarily just particularly a thing around death, it's a thing about the way societies functioning well as communities. But I think also there's some very, very elaborate tombstones and grave ornaments and some very traditional things which would have quite negative environmental impacts. So I think it's a case of, I think this is something where communities and individuals and groups of people really need to work it out for themselves. I think the idea is not that people be trapped and directed towards one particular thing. And I think, you were talking about the climate impacts of this, but it was always, we've got to weigh the climate impacts up against the human impacts and, the benefits. And if something, is really terribly important to the surviving family, that can justify some carbon emissions, because that's something that's really important and really matters. Where I think is the concern where, like the plastic handles or something, that actually, a little bit of thought within the industry, different ways of doing things, it wouldn't make any difference at all to families' experience, families' understanding of what's happening. All of this could be done without really disturbing people. And so it's a cost benefit in all kinds of ways, but you can't, of course, lose the human element. That's
really well articulated dilemma. And interesting, I think the pandemic really showed that up, because we really saw what people lost through not being able to gather together and have the funeral that they expected and wanted and needed. And yet also the kind of grass shoots that came up from that, of the really creative ways through it that people found to connect with each other in a really human way, which wasn't about the trappings of a funeral that we've come to know and expect.
And I think, I mean, I would think one of the things that's come out of that is, although it was horrendous that we had to institute Zoom funerals because so few people were able to go, but it also means if we've now created a practice whereby regularly funeral ceremonies are streamed, available to anyone, that distant cousin who was really close friends with someone as a child in South Africa or wherever, it may never have been financially or whatever able to come to the funeral, but at least now they may have access to participate in the ceremony in a way that they haven't historically, because that's now become so much more of a normal part of our life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a wonderful development. In the conference that we recently held, Go Greener conference, we had a talk about greenwashing, and I was amazed by his statistics around the whole concept of planting a tree, of offsetting carbon emissions. So I wanted to ask you what your view was on offsetting, kind of as broadly or as specifically as you wish, really.
I would say, to start off with, my single sentence answer to that is offsetting is a con, because what we have to do is both look after nature, store carbon emissions, and stop emitting. So where you see the situation, where the airline advertises, hey, you can fly without guilt because we're going to plant some trees, that's not, it's not an either or. It's we need to both plant the trees and reduce the emissions from aviation. And so, obviously, the idea of, planting a tree for a loved one, planting a number of trees for a loved one is a lovely thing to do, and it's a positive thing to do. But to regard that as something that means you can keep doing something else that's damaging is an utterly wrong-headed idea. And it's an idea essentially of business as usual, which we know with the climate emergency and the nature crisis, we cannot continue as business as usual. And some of the same issues arise around storing carbon in soil, which is a lot more complex than people think it is. In terms of the idea that you can just sort of chuck a whole lot of carbon onto the soil and it will sit there. You will actually, all of those microbes and that we were talking about earlier will all, churn it up, use all those nutrients, create all sorts of life. If you plant a tree, or you plant a forest, how long will that forest survive? What happens if there's a fire? So the idea that this counteracts damaging things, we really need to get away from that, which doesn't mean that we can't celebrate and encourage, people planting trees wherever they can possibly can.
Yeah, okay, that's very clear. Thank you. And finally, certainly after the conference that we held, the Go Greener conference, I came away inspired, but also completely overwhelmed. And I suppose increasingly, as I become more and more conscious of kind of how we've constructed life around us and how unsustainable it is, at times I feel paralyzed on almost, in the moment I feel paralyzed. So again, as broadly or specifically as you wish, from your experience with just general people like me, do you have kind of tips on what you advise short-term, mid-term and long-term as the most kind of profound actions, but realistic actions that you can take to go greener?
Well, first of all, what I would say is that I'm not concerned about individual action, individual behavior. We have a system that really pushes people to pollute, pushes people to create carbon emissions. There's no point in waving a finger at people and saying, hey, you shouldn't take the car to work, you should catch the bus, if the last bus from to your village leaves at 5:30 and you finish work at 6 o'clock. And individual changes that you might be able to make, great if you can do them, but acknowledge that, I've met some people who've, dedicated a year of their life to trying to, in that whole year, to only produce, a little jar of plastic waste. And they've spent hours cycling across town to go and buy the one container they can find that doesn't contain plastic or something. What I'd much rather see those people do is putting a large amount of that time and energy into working with others to create system change, to do politics, essentially. And I've just come back from a couple of school visits, and my message to them, as my message to everyone, is make politics what you do, not have done to you. The way we tackle the climate emergency and the nature crisis is by getting together with our work colleagues, with our friends, with our neighbours, with our classmates at school, whoever it is, people getting together and tackling things around them to change the system, to make the green thing to do the easiest, cheapest, simplest and best thing to do. So, the kind of example I mean is I spoke to a school and they invited me for lunch, and because I was a VIP, they gave me proper cutlery to eat my baked potato with. And everyone else was trying to eat their baked potato with plastic disposable knives and forks. And I said, here's a great campaign. You will actually get to enjoy your lunch better, actually be able to eat it. You will save some plastic in the world. You might even save the school some money. And you will then, if you run that campaign as successful, you've learned how to campaign, how to change things, and then you can go on to the next thing. So, the key thing is really that, acting as an individual has very limited impacts. Getting together with others, and you don't have to say, right, we're going to form a little local group and we're going to fix climate change. That's, a unrealistic goal. But saying we're going to get together and make it easier for the kids to get to a local park by getting in a pedestrian crossing, that's an achievable goal and something that really improves people's lives, gets people more active, makes them more ready to walk or cycle to school instead of using the car, all those sorts of things. All those small changes, but also very much that empowerment of people adds up.
Thank you. That's so useful and so informative. Thank you so much for your time, Natalie. I know you're massively busy. We haven't heard any dings or pings, but I'm sure there'll be some soon.
No worries.
It was just really, really useful and fascinating to talk to you, and thank you for everything that you do on our behalf. We're very well.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this discussion, and I think it is important that we do talk about funerals and death, as I said earlier. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for having this conversation.
Thank you, Natalie.